Every engagement with the sword can essentially be broken down into a string of attacks and defenses. What determines the winner is when one or both fighters either do not perceive a threat to themselves or do not heed it. This is one of the main reasons that it's important to understand not only the consequences of being overzealous to strike our opponent, but also of understanding the opponent themselves. What type of person are they? Can I rely on them to perceive the danger they're in and attempt to safeguard their own life? Or will they strike randomly, thinking only to hit and not to survive? Throwing a feint against such an opponent will likely result in the untimely demise for both. Let's take a simple example. My opponent strikes at me with an oberau. I defend with krumpau, crossing over their blade and subjugating it beneath mine. From here, there is one primary option that I've gained, the streiken, or the short edge rising cut. The thing is, when I arrive in the position to throw the streiken, my opponent also perceives the danger to his face, and as I move to strike, he moves up to hangen to defend the opening. If I continue the attack and land my streiken on his guard, he will easily run off the blade and strike me with an oberau on the other side. So, rather than follow through with my useless attack, I merely imply it. As my opponent moves to hangen to defend his face, I wind out, using mutieren to capture his blade and thrust around it to the body. At each step of this process, I was foiled. But as I perceived the responses of my opponent and flowed off to new targets as they opened, I got further and further ahead until my victory was assured. Let's take a look at another simple example. Again, my opponent attacks with an oberau. This time, I defend it with an oberau to cross it, ending up in the bind. I take the blade, raising my guard and using the leverage I gain to bear his blade offline to his right. I'm now well positioned for a nice thrust to the torso. But again, as I gain position to effect my attack, my opponent also perceives their opening, and as I attack, he moves to close it by bearing my blade off to my right. Now, if I let him continue in this position of control, he will now have the vor, which puts me on the back foot. Rather than find myself at his mercy, the moment I feel his pressure, I move on to my next target. He presses me to the right, so I switch up to ox, step towards his pressure, run off the blade, and strike an oberau to the head. But he's an experienced fighter, and feeling me leave the bind, he knows he has an opportunity. He moves instinctively to defend his outside line. Now, I can see my oberau will not land, so in the moment I switch from the long edge to the short edge, and continue that attack in the same line, allowing the blade to wrap around the back and strike behind his sword. So once again, in every situation here, I'm foiled in my attacks, but each attack leads to a defense, which, if ignored, will end the fight. Each defense opens up a new line of attack, and a new target which forces my opponent to resist attacking in return and continue their defensive efforts. But sir, I hear you say, when I try strings of attack like this, we always end up with double hits. And I can completely understand why it seems that way. I too have situations like this come up, and it usually comes back to one of two things. First is attacking with force into a sure defense. Anytime you do this, you're likely to lose the vor, as you've basically killed your momentum and given your opponent a reasonable expectation of being able to riposte and either hit or force you to parry. If you ignore their attack in favor of continuing your own, getting hit is pretty much inevitable. Second is my use of Zufechten, or pre-fencing. Zufechten is probably the most important part of any encounter. It is where we test our opponents to see what they do, how they react. What kind of fencer are they? Do they attack constantly? Do they sit back and wait for me to attack? How perceptive are they? How defensive are they? Do they know what they're doing? Do they know what I'm doing? All of these things and many more are essential pieces of information if we desire to survive the encounter. If our opponent is not especially perceptive to our feints or our attacks, if he is more interested in being erratic and attacking in combination with little regard for our movements, it will come out in the Zufechten. This is, of course, an extremely dangerous situation. I mean, even if you're untrained, a wildly unpredictable novice has slain many a journeyman swordsman, even if they likely died in the process. It's not that hard to strike someone if you don't mind being struck as well. An Italian fencing master by the name of Carlo Giuseppe Colombani, and I'm probably butchering his name here, advises us on this particular situation in his treatise, L'Arte Maestre, and said the following. You should first, however, try and avoid drawing your sword against one who understands little of the art. If you are wounded, your entire reputation is lost, but if you wound or kill him, it will grant you no honor. If you must draw your sword, though, never jest with him, because in not understanding the danger, he could charge forward, or leave himself in front of you, whereupon he might shame you. I advise instead that you put yourself well in guard and stay covered. If he strikes desperately, let him throw. If he enters into measure, you should retreat while always in guard. In the end, after he has thrown 10 or 12 strikes without effect, you can either wound him if you wish, or take his sword by coming to the grapple, and leave him for the ignorant that he is. Reason will be yours, however, as reason is the foundation of the art of the sword.